there, everyone. I'm Deborah Cohen. I'm the director of the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, and it is our complete pleasure to present this program this afternoon with Paul Gowder and Jennifer Forrestal. I'm going to introduce them both, and then they will come and begin the discussion. Paul Gowder is one of the rare law school professors who was a lawyer before he was a professor, before he was a faculty member. In his practice days, he was a civil rights lawyer who worked, among other things, to represent victims of predatory lending, police misconduct, employment discrimination, eviction, domestic violence, and other injustices. At Northwestern, at the Pritzker School of Law, which he joined in 2020, he focuses on a huge variety of topics, including democratic theory, social and racial equality, the classical Athenian law and political thought, as well as law and technology. He is the author of 3 books. The Networked Leviathan, which we get to hear about today, is his 3rd book. The other 2 are The Rule of Law and The Real World, which is a fantastic title, and The Rule of Law in the United States, an unfinished project of Black liberation. Joining him in discussion will be Jennifer Forrestal, the Helen Houlihan Regali Assistant Professor of Political Science at Loyola University here in Chicago. Professor Forrestal's research and teaching interests are in the sphere of political theory. Her first book, Designing for Democracy, How to Build Community in Digital Environments, which was published by Oxford in 2022, looks at the role of design in building more democratic social media platforms. So you can see why she's the perfect person to be in discussion about this book. This new book, Designing for Democracy, was awarded the Price Award for Best Book on Science, Technology, and Politics from the American Political Science Association, as well as the Information Technology and Politics section's Best Book Award. She is also a homegrown product, having received her PhD from Northwestern. So thanks so much for being here. We're really looking forward to hearing about the book in conversation. So thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take the pacing mic because I'm one of those people who cannot stand still while talking, and let's just be honest about that. So this book actually came about through a weird confluence of events. You know, me, the mild-mannered constitutional law professor, actually found himself around basically 2018, 2019, embedded as the in-house democratic theorist on Facebook's civic integrity team, which at the time was the group of people who were trying to prevent the platform from blowing up the world again after the platform had already blown up the world a few times. You know, I say that partly just as sort of context for how this happened, partly also to sort of lead with a kind of bias check, because after all, Facebook has paid me money. It hasn't been for like 5 years. I didn't get any money from him while this book was going on, but, you know, apply whatever grains of salt you want to for that. But, you know, this is a book about this sort of notion of platform governance, TM, which, you know, means one of 2 things, right? Sometimes people use the words platform governance to mean governance of platforms, to mean regulation by governments saying, you know, hey, like you have to do age verification if you've got certain content, for example. But a lot of the time, what we're really concerned about, and this really causes a lot of social conflict, is governance by platforms. And for platforms, you can just think social media companies. Like, let's just call it social media. But like, it turns out that a lot of people have come to the realization over the last few years that a lot of what these companies, you know, Facebook, YouTube, the company formerly known as Twitter, do is like govern user conduct, but do so in a really problematic way. Problematic both because it's not clear that they should have any right to do this, and because they screw up all the time in really horrible ways. I mean, nobody, including the people at the companies, want, for example, the genocide that was carried out in Myanmar, which was carried out in large part, I won't say due to, but greatly facilitated by the Myanmar military's propagation of hate speech about the Rohingya minority over Facebook and Facebook's failure to control that hate speech. You know, like Mark Zuckerberg literally has to wake up every morning and know that he's culpable in a genocide. And this isn't just a moral burden for the companies. This is a genuine economic burden for the companies as well. You know, some of you may be familiar with 4chan, the evil website where like basically racists and domestic terrorists and all of their buddies love to talk to one another about racism and domestic terrorism and how much they love it. See also Gab, see also Parler, etc., etc. And the thing about those websites is they're not exactly money makers. And it shouldn't be surprising that they're not exactly moneymakers, because it turns out, A, that normal mass market consumers like all of us in this room don't particularly want to be on those websites. It also turns out that advertisers with a large advertising spend budget don't particularly want to spend that budget on that website. In fact, even the big mainstream platforms have experienced serious consequences from failures of platform governance, serious economic consequences. YouTube famously experienced advertiser boycotts because it turns out their failures of governance were meaning that, you know, advertisements for Pepsi were being inserted into like Animal Crush videos and things like that. Yet it turns out that advertisers don't really like that. And, you know, there's a reason that post-Elon Twitter is much, much worse and also much, much less profitable, because it turns out when you've got a billionaire who doesn't care about profit, these incentives drop away. But this really means that, again, these failures of governance ought to be surprising. Like, if I'm right that COVID misinformation and hate speech and election denialism are bad for the economic interests of the companies that run these websites, then we need to come up with some idea of why it's happening to figure out what we can do about it. And so I actually think there are two big problems that these companies face that leads to these challenges. We can call them the problem of knowledge and the problem of incentives. The problem of knowledge is that these platforms, like the economic model of an internet platform, really lends itself to volume and complexity in a deep way. Like, the economics of these platforms are users benefit more the more users there are on there. This is known as positive network externalities. The companies make their revenue by taxing, essentially, activity. The most familiar form of an activity tax, of course, is advertisement, which taxes the attention that people on the platform want to give to cat pictures by making them give some of it to an advertisement for Pepsi. And so this creates incentives for the companies to grow, both in the kinds of activities that people can use the platforms for, and the number and diversity of people on the platforms. And what this tends to mean is you get really surprising activity, right? So think about a city. Think about the city of Chicago. You might have noticed that like the city of Chicago is in a constant state of chaos, right? Like you turn around and there's another politician going to jail. I mean, you know, maybe New York would have been a better example for this right now. Sorry, Eric. You know, the cities try to like repair Lakeshore Drive, and somehow they manage to do so in such a way that people's tires blow out. I mean, yeah, the city is sort of inherently a place of chaos. And the reason that the city is a place of chaos is the same reason that a social media company is a place of chaos, is because when you've got mass, diverse, complex, interconnected behavior with everybody involved having an incentive to get more of it, you get like emergent surprises. You know, technically what we can say is that platforms like cities are complex systems, and complex systems tend to generate things that just cannot be predicted and managed in the ordinary sense. Another example that we'll all be familiar with is climates. You know, one of the reasons that climate change has become in the lexicon climate change as opposed to global warming, which it used to be, is because we've come to recognize that there is no simple linear prediction that we can apply to the outcomes of climate change. Sometimes it's a lot hotter, sometimes it's a lot colder, sometimes it's stormy, sometimes everything's on fire. And sometimes everything on fire is perhaps a truly apt analogy for what happens on these platforms. Add in the fact that the governance by companies in these platforms is being done from not only the United States typically, but typically one of the most culturally isolated parts of the United States, dealing with global behavior. And we can see how it's just like fundamentally impossible for companies to figure out what's going on at the margins of their various user communities. All right. What about the problem of incentives? Well, I said to you a few minutes ago that companies have an incentive to tamp down on terrible behavior because neither mainstream users nor advertisers particularly enjoy that behavior. But what I didn't say is that that's really a long-term oriented behavior, incentive. It's really an incentive focused on maintaining long-term usage, maintaining credibility of the platform for and to advertisers. In the short term, there are a lot of conflicting incentives, and these are both internal and external. Internal, because everybody in the company has people whose job it is to maximize this week's number of click-throughs, right? And so, you know, I'll give you an example that I know it. On Facebook, they change the names of the teams all the time, but there's been a growth team, and that growth team has historically been in conflict with integrity teams because the growth team has incentives to maximize the people who are clicking on things on the website. I mean, maximize daily active users. That's a short-term incentive. It conflicts with the long-term incentives of not turning it into a toxic swamp. We also know that politicians, not just abroad, right, not just the Modi regime in India, but also the Trump regime in the United States, have loved to pressure platforms to permit content that otherwise would not be permitted. And again, this represents a kind of short-term incentive conflict. Do you mollify the politician now, or do you protect the integrity of the communicative ecosystem long-term? So, What do we do about it? Well, I've got a clickbait slide. It turns out that there's some reason, albeit incredibly debated, but some reason to believe that well-designed democratic institutions have historically had properties that, at least in principle, could be well suited. How many caveats can I shove into one sentence? At least in principle, could be well suited to mitigate these problems. So number one feature of, again, well-designed, and we'll talk about that in a minute, democracies is they can be pretty decent at moving information from the peripheries of a governance universe to the center. Basically, if you empower people to make decisions based on their own knowledge of the world and their own incentives, and you give them some actual reason to care about the content of those decisions, then at least sometimes it turns out that the input rooted in their decision-making power can generate decisions that take into account perspectives, knowledge, and experiences that aren't held by a bunch of engineers sitting in Menlo Park or Mountain View or San Francisco. It also, again, designed the right way, can be the case that by empowering people who have pro-social long-term incentives, that democratic institutions can mitigate some of these incentive conflicts that I discussed. In other words, think about sort of quintessential example, think about workplace democracy. Oftentimes when we talk about workplace democracy, one of the ideas we have is, workers actually have a stake in the long-term sustainability of the businesses where they work and in the long-term sustainability of the communities where they work. And so empowering workers with democratic voice might mitigate against the short-termist perspectives of managers who are interested in next week's stock market value. So there's one other reason that I think the idea of democratizing big tech, basically, should have some appeal to us. And it's because, particularly with social media, we're dealing with these global communicative ecosystems. And nobody, and I really mean nobody, has a moral right to govern them except the people themselves. We obviously, not one person in this room trusts Mark Zuckerberg to make decisions about the global public sphere. But I'll submit to you that also not one person in this room trusts the US government to make decisions about the global public sphere. There are very few governments that we would trust to make decisions about the global public sphere. And so to some extent, the case for platform democracy also is just, there ain't nobody else who's going to be able to do it. Okay. I said properly designed a bunch of times, and now I'm echoing. And properly designed is a genuinely hard problem. And so, in this book, I've sketched a few pieces of what properly designed might look like. I mean, I sketched a whole thing, but the sketching of the whole thing is really more of a fantasy than a reality. It turns out that the one time that anyone actually took what some academics said and just tried to implement it directly into the law, it turned out to be the Soviet Union. And so, let's not do that. But I think at the very least we can sketch out some sort of basic principles And one of the most important comes from, Elinor Ostrom and other sort of theorists who focused on phenomena like governance of shared resources, where you also have these kinds of complex systems where there's lots of different constituents, where those constituents often have reasons to come into conflict and reasons to share their knowledge with one another. And one of the sort of key insights of the Elinor Ostrom school is known as polycentricity, basically the idea being that we ought to kind of lean into the conflicts and the different interests and different knowledge bases of the people who have interests in these systems. And so what this recommends is creating like overlapping governance organizations, overlapping participatory governance organizations, overlapping participatory real-world governance organizations, with the idea being that if we do it the right way, we can bring people in communication with one another to both share their understanding of what's going on and what's going wrong with their communicative ecosystems and share their tools for fixing it. I'll take just a minute to give you one example of how I think this might work. So, in Thailand, there's a well-known law against defaming the monarchy. Right, like it's one of the ways that Thailand is culturally distinct from a lot of other countries is the monarchy has this like immunity from like negative speech. And there are two things that you might think about that, and I'll submit both of those are true. Thing number one, this is a legitimate example of cultural divergence, and people in the United States, including the people in the United States who own social media platforms, ought to respect that. Proposition number two, this is really easy to use for political repression, and military dictators and other agents that may want to suppress speech that's, democratically legitimate ought not to be coddled. If you happen, as I do, to hold both of those thoughts in your head at the same time, and then the Thai government comes to you, someone who works at Google or Facebook and says, hey, this video is insulting the king, take it down, you've got a real problem. Because as an employee of the company, you don't have any really good way of knowing what this is. Is this a case where the speech is genuinely a violation of Thai cultural norms, or is it a speech where the government is trying to suppress dissent? You don't have access to that knowledge. You can't ask the Thai government because the Thai government might be trying to suppress dissent. You can't make the decision on your own. You certainly can't ask the US government, like, are you kidding me? So what you really should be able to do is go directly to an empowered group of ordinary Thai people and say, hey, so about this video, is this request from the government legitimate? The devil's in the details, of course. Maybe the Thai government is threatening these people. Maybe these people were selected in an improper way. But at least at the high level, it seems to me that something like that tool would be the only way to actually get us to the capacity to make the kinds of decisions that these companies are making on a day-to-day basis. How do we get there? I mean, again, like, if any of you has like a strong connection to the State Department, feel absolutely free to tell them they should just take the last chapter of my book, rip it out, take it to, a treaty negotiation and sign it. I'm down with that. It ain't happening, but if it did happen, I would celebrate. In reality, I suspect that any kinds of pro-democratic platform governance reforms would be incremental. And I think we have a lot of incremental places to go, right? So my key example of an incremental reform would be, right now, there are a lot of workers who don't even get treated as workers in these companies. Okay, one more story. Am I okay on time? Am I? Okay, one very quick story, and then I'll stop. Very quick story. So a few years back, there was this like great headline in the newspapers. You know, Facebook was finally standing up an office in the Philippines because Rodrigo Duterte, you know, was using the platform to bully his political opponents. And like they were gonna have people on the ground to see what was going on and respond to it. Here's the thing about that story. That story was insane because Facebook had employees in the Philippines for years before that. It just so happens that those employees were outsourced content moderators who had no channels of communication or influence with the company. And so I say that labor rights are a potential incremental reform because so many of these companies already have like direct sources of information and potential constraint in a lot of the global settings where they're experiencing governance failures. It's just that nobody's forcing them to take those workers seriously as constituents of their products. We can change that. I think that there's a debate about antitrust right now. You know, a lot of people, you know, Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley want to break up big tech. Far be it from me to disagree with both Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley, but I think that we can use competition policy in a more like a scalpel than a hammer by trying to sort of carve out which tools companies should be able to share and which they ought to have isolate on their own. We can maybe use governance policy to start to create institutions to constrain companies. We can talk more about this down the line. I'll skip over the last two, where I don't want to kill us too much on time, but ask me about them. And I'll just tell you, there's my cat. His name is Leonidas. If we're talking about social media, we have to have a cat picture. That you can actually, for those of you who missed the free physical copies, the Knight Foundation kindly gave me money to make this book open access. And so you can simply download a PDF. But let's stop us there.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Forstall. I guess I will start our discussion by saying thank you so much to Paul and the Buffett Center for inviting me to be here because this is a fabulous book and I'm excited to discuss it with everybody. So there's a lot to, I'll just say a few words and then I will ask Paul some questions and then I think we're going to open it up to your questions. So I will try and keep my part short so as to get to the more interesting questions. But first, I just want to say, for those who maybe haven't read the book or are not as well versed in the sort of field that Paul is intervening in, there is a bunch to appreciate about the book itself, but also I think the kind of unique blend of experiences and therefore expertise that Paul brings to this project. He mentioned it a little bit up front as a caveat, but I think we should also think about it as a strength. He brings his background in law, in political science, but also, again, in the practice of platform governance itself, right? So, and this sort of combines into one of the few books that's out there that takes seriously both democratic commitments and also the kind of pragmatic concerns of how to design institutions that are required to manifest those commitments. So a lot of people talk about the commitments and a lot of people talk about the problems, and Paul sort of brings them together in a way that's, I think, really productive. So I am deeply sympathetic to this project, both in the framing of the problem and also in the proposed solutions. The idea that democratic platforms are going to be or include aspects that are kind of polycentric, inclusive, participatory, adaptive, meaning that they're designed in a way to continue to change over time as we meet new problems or new challenges. But I do, as is my job, have some questions for you. And so, again, sort of take them as they are a sort of co-conspirator asking you to expand on this work. I guess I have a kind of in the weeds question, but first I'll start with something a little bit more broad, which maybe you can get to your third bullet point especially, which is that your book starts off with the claim that platforms have these incentives to moderate and moderate well, which I think are compelling, that there are good and convincing reasons to think they might sign on to this project, that you're sort of outlining here, because there's a lot of reasons, right? One, it might shield them from some unsavory political stuff, right? They can say like, well, no, we're being told to do this by this external group. It gives us some legitimacy to protect their economic interests, to like clean up the platforms in ways that are, more beneficial in the long run economically, just because they want to, because they're like invested in democracy, because they too have to live in the world that they are creating. And again, I want to insist that I found these compelling. But then I read the news. And it seems like we're seeing a trend of CEOs and founders of these companies specifically not doing the work that you seem to indicate they might want to. Setting aside Elon Musk, I'll do you that favor, although I'm not sure that the audience will. But even setting that case aside, Steve Huffman, who is the CEO of Reddit, recently ran roughshod over his own user base to go IPO. So for those that don't know, he made a series of decisions that very much upset the users of Reddit, and they complained by going on strike. They shut down a bunch of aspects of the website, and Steve Huffman basically said, well, we're going to replace all of you that went on strike, and we're going to go IPO and make all the changes anyway. Not a great idea, maybe, for a CEO who wants to go public. Likewise, Mark Zuckerberg recently came out publicly saying that he was, quote, wrong to cave to the government's pressure to suppress COVID-19 misinformation, and that the company would push back, I think was his quote, against this pressure in the future. So given these examples and what we know about the kind of ideological bent of Silicon Valley elites, I want to stress, maybe not the sort of workers, are you as optimistic that we can get this kind of voluntary compliance that you mentioned at the end? And if not, do you think that this would still have the same kind of effect if mandated? Can you sort of mandate democracy?
Oh yeah, no, that's great. And I think, I mean, the reality is that the incentives of certainly Silicon Valley leaders are really complicated, right? I mean, so of course, as you know, I mean, there are so many counterexamples to the counterexamples that certainly from the years further back, like Twitter until Elon took it over was really doing amazing work to try to build sort of community-based like trust and safety. I mean, TikTok of all people created trust and safety councils. Mark Zuckerberg created the oversight board. I have a whole chapter about the oversight board. That one, I will confess, directly results from my bias because I also had a hand in that. But the companies seem to go back and forth as to whether they're actually trying to sincerely, serve what I see as their long-term interest. And part of this is, I think, frankly, sometimes the companies and their leaders aren't so clear on what their long-term interests are. I think that, it's quite possible to say that there was real damage done to Reddit by that behavior, and real economic damage as well. I mean, it so happens that when you're doing an IPO, right, it's a sort of classic case of short-term incentives, because all of a sudden you've got a really salient constituency in the financial community that you have to be accountable to. And if you don't satisfy that constituency right now, then your IPO is going to hell in a handbasket. And so, I mean, in a lot of ways, that's a great example of the difference between short-term and long-term interests. But I think the other thing is that it's not obvious to me that the sort of choices of company leaders are sort of wholly exogenous to policy. And it was I guess one way that I like to think of it is that government coercion, if you want to call it that. I'm into it. That's what governments do. Can cause company leaders to focus on their own long-term interests rather than their short-term interests. And so to that extent, I mean, I don't think that any of the sort of weird choices made by the leaders of these companies can undermine that.
Okay, so I guess I would love to hear more in that. Are you saying then that the leaders themselves are sort of malleable in a way based on the institutions, or that we can sort of work around them even if they are going to continue making poor decisions?
I mean, I kind of want to think the former, right? I mean, it is really striking that the same guy who like Mark Zuckerberg has done so much stuff in so many directions, right? Like the same guy who said, well, I was wrong to moderate COVID misinformation is also the guy who, based on like a phone call with his buddy Noah Feldman, like decided to create himself a like personal Supreme Court composed of human rights lawyers, you know, is the same guy who publishes this like famous blog post as a Facebook note talking about how even the content that doesn't violate his own rules is like actually really bad and like explicitly sort of reflecting on the incentives that the company has to promote really crappy content that doesn't violate their own rules and like thinking in public about what to do about that, right? Like, I mean, this is, and I don't want to psychoanalyze individual people, but like this sort of this economy where so many of these companies, and especially Facebook and Twitter, are really identified with individual people, sort of really lends itself to it, right? Like, you know, Mark Zuckerberg is just some guy, and like all the rest of us, like I'm sure that he sometimes finds himself conflicted. I mean, you know, a lot of times I can read, like, you know, I'll read one book arguing for one position. I'll be like, yeah, you know what? I'm convinced by that. And then I'll read the book refuting that position. I'll be like, yeah, you know what? I'm convinced by that too, right? Like we all have this experience of just not really being sure what's right. And I don't really think that the leaders of these companies are immune to that.
Thanks. So I want to change directions and ask my in the weeds question, just because I guess I can, and then we can open it up. But one of the arguments in the book is that democratizing platforms is good, not just because it's good in itself, though it is, and I think you would agree, but also because it does solve these kind of knowledge problems. And so the underlying idea here is supported by what we in the business call epistemic democracy or democratic knowledge, right? And which is the idea that we make better decisions in groups. And so by designing certain participatory institutions, we can help platforms make better decisions, more informed decisions, more nuanced decisions, et cetera. And I think this is right. But one of the things that struck me, even and I'll go back to the Thai example that you raised in the presentation, is that like the literature that you're drawing on presumes that ordinary citizens deliberating in these bodies have some sense of shared kind of buy-in or ownership over the thing at stake. That's part of the reason why an exchange of diverse opinions works rather than kind of breaking down. It turns into something better than we might think it does. So in the book, you use the example of Athens in the sense, which is maybe more complicated for those that haven't read it, but in ancient Athens, like one of the sort of benefits of a system that they designed was that it sort of split the Athenians into different groups that were in some ways made sense sort of geographically, and in some sense were just totally artificially sort of breaking up the demos into little demes or demes, but they were all still Athenian. Right. And so they understood themselves to be both like a farmer and an Athenian, or both a merchant and an Athenian. Same in the Reddit example. So you use the example of Reddit where you say, well, you know, you can have users and moderators that are coming from different backgrounds that can sort of serve as checks on one another, but they're all still Redditors and they all still have some kind of investment in the platform. And so we were talking a lot about sort of, it's clear that the companies have an investment in cleaning up their platform. But how do we ensure that everyone else involved, the kind of ordinary people that you want to bring in, view themselves as similarly invested in the platform? So in the Thai example, how do you make sure that the people deliberating are thinking of themselves as Facebook users and Thai people, citizens, instead of just Thai citizens or, you know, some other facet of their identity?
I should have seen that question coming. For those of you who don't know, Jenny's done, I think, fantastic work, particularly on thinking about Reddit as this kind of distinctive, community-oriented mode of doing platform democracy. So you should really read her work. That question sort of comes straight out of it, which is totally fair. I guess I have sort of two thoughts about that, right? Like one is that, well, I could have a bunch of thoughts about that. So one is there are two reasons that we might think that this kind of institutional commitment is necessary. Reason one is just to get participation at all, right? Reason number two is to get sincere sort of public-oriented participation, see Rousseau. I think the participation at all part is easy because we can bloody well just pay them. It turns out the companies spend like quintillions of dollars on this project, like we can simply pay them. The question of decisional quality and particular sort of like public-oriented decisional quality, I think is a little bit harder. I mean, some of that is constructed, right? So, the thing about Cleisthenes' reforms that was in a lot of ways so brilliant is that like partly they created the identification institutionally. Like a big idea of the reforms was, okay, we're going to get the farmers and we're going to get like the merchants in the city and we're going to put them in the same group. And by like creating these artifactual entities, we encourage an identification with those entities and up into the city rather than the other way around. I mean, the detailed proposal that I give, which again, no one on earth is actually going to enact, but the detailed proposal that I give does take that into consideration. Like one of the bases, though I don't know if I say so explicitly, but like one of the ideas underneath, like creating basically a bunch of citizen juries that also mixes people from different cultures into the sort of specifically regional citizen juries is to permit this sort of broader perspective taken in part by bringing, the people on the Thailand jury into interaction with a few people who are from other places. And so I think to some extent that can mitigate that. I think the other thing that I would want to say is that I do think that sort of empirically at least, and I mean, it's hard to know because, I'm subject to my own cultural biases, right? Like it's hard to know how much people in Thailand think of themselves as like interacting with the platform in a global sense. Certainly, like Americans seem to simultaneously like interact with these companies as Americans and as like people oriented to these platforms. Like they seem to think of themselves as having like Facebook rights and YouTube rights that, while derived from their American rights, aren't identical to them. So I think there's some empirical reason to think that that's possible, but I mean, yeah, it's still an open question.
Yeah, I guess my question is more is in addition to thinking of like my American rights on Facebook or sort of however that interaction goes, is like there's a question of whether people on Facebook think of themselves as in community with other people on Facebook. So you have like a super interesting section at the end of chapter 5 where you talk about the identity of platforms, which seems really important to actually what you're thinking about, right? Because you want to acknowledge that like platforms do different things and like we can't, something they should sort of insist on rightly, I think, is like we can't actually just create a set of rules for all social media platforms because they're very different from each other, and they should be, right? It's like okay for something like Twitter to operate differently with different rules and norms than it is for something like Facebook, than it is for something like Reddit. But in order to sort of have that kind of refined conversation in these citizen juries, you have to have jurors who sort of understand the difference in the identity on those platforms. And I guess I am skeptical that the way that Facebook is designed and the way that people interact with Facebook as users gets them to think about Facebook as a community that they share, rather than just like a place where they go to connect with their networks that they already have offline as individuals. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. You're making me think that at some point I need to write a paper called Platform Cosmopolitanism.
Yes, yes, that would be great.
I like at that paper I need to figure out what I believe about that because I'm not actually sure. I don't know that I have a good answer right now to that, but I feel like I need one.
Well, I can't wait for you to write that paper. Okay, I guess let's open it up for questions from the audience. Yeah. Do you want? I can just speak loudly. I think
Oh yeah, we've got Zoom.
Oh, thanks. Hi, my name is Anna Pichena. I'm a political science comparative institutionalist by training, so I appreciate the shout out. But I'm also an institutional kind of evaluation person by trade. Love the topic. I haven't had a chance to read your book, but I had a few thoughts, and can I ask multiple questions or just one?
Go wild.
Okay. it just opens up a whole host of questions and possibilities in my head. And first thing that you mentioned was the tension between regulatory regimes of each individual state that have their own sovereignty versus the corporational needs to, make money, right? And also trying to build a democratic institution or governance within that corporation to manage its own community, right? So to me, and I'm Russian also by birth, and watching what's happening with YouTube and Meta in Russia, given the context of geopolitics with the war and demonetization, the loss of revenue for those companies, and also how government cracks down on individuals who are engaged in these democratic activities. First, little question that I have. When you're trying to do citizen juries, in addition to the cosmopolitanism angle of it, also the risks associated with doing that type of work. And there are people who will be activists and volunteers who are interested in doing that work regardless of the pressures. But I'm skeptical given my own background watching it unfold. So that's one thing. What are your thoughts on that? And the other question I have, what are your thoughts on Pavel Durov's situation? He created Telegram platform. It's really popular, especially with shady people, but also with Russians because it's really secure. And recently French government arrested him or detained him to question about his activities because there's a lot of questionable, problematic criminal activities going down on the platform, and he refuses to hand over any information. So again, this is a tension of he's hyper democratic in the sense of no regulatory anything of freedom of speech. We do not touch speech. People can do whatever they want. French government disagrees because they have courts who say this is criminal, we need the information. He refuses to cooperate. And the last question for the juries, I said I had a lot of questions. For the juries or for the external panels of individuals, a solution potentially engaging courts or creating additional courts in each country, maybe within their own regulatory system, who will have internal legitimacy to the country, right? That individuals who live there might be more willing to accept the ruling from, that then these corporations could comply with. I don't know, just the thought, would love to hear your reaction.
So I think I can actually bring these questions together in a lot of ways. I mean, I'll start with the middle, right? Because I'm not sure that I would describe sort of Telegram libertarianism as hyper-democratic, right? I mean, but I think that matters, right? Because I take it that the real problem with the Telegram case is that we don't actually have a legitimate way to adjudicate between, on the one hand, France wants to enforce, its laws, whatever they may be, and on the other hand, this company wants to run an encrypted anything goes platform. And so there's really a void of governance in a sort of stronger sense. The risk question, I think there are two answers to it, really. Answer number one is sort of brutish realism, right? Any reform that we can create, any governance institutions that we can create are always going to have a big asterisk on them. And that big asterisk is some people have lots of guns and those people with lots of guns could often override governance institutions. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. That's true in consolidated democracies such as they are as well. Here we are, we live in a fallen world. I do think that, there's, and I hate to say this because it smacks of the sort of weird techno, fetishism crowd that annoys me. But it may be that for the special case of like governing technology companies in a grassroots way, there might actually be technical mitigations available. Like, you know, we can do amazing things with cryptography. And like one of the amazing things that we might be able to do with cryptography is at least partly shield individuals from pressure by governments, by, I mean, you name it, right? Like apply some kind of differential privacy framework to like people's contributions to citizen juries. Like, you know, we do have capacities to at least intervene a little bit in that sense. Remind me what your third question was? Oh yeah, so the like internal courts, right? I mean, I think that for the case of legitimate democracies that are relatively stable, I think that, you know, the idea of incorporating sort of local judiciaries or sort of like, you know, specialized wings of local judiciaries into these decision-making processes makes sense. I mean, I actually, you know, I think about the sort of the controversy over Brazil right now, like implementing a Twitter ban. And I mean, in all honesty, I have a lot of sympathy with Brazil for that. I mean, you know, like Elon Musk was quite deliberately flouting Brazilian law. And, you know, there doesn't seem to have been anything particularly wrong with that law. Like, yeah, like that's what happens. But I think, you know, even in the US, I think that some of the contortions that our courts have gotten themselves into suggest that the maybe we shouldn't trust governments to do the governing for the global internet is a caveat that also applies to judiciaries.
Hi, I'm very intrigued by, first of all, by the title of your book, Networked Leviathan. It kind of struck me as a reflection of what Yanis Varoufakis talks about, techno-feudalism that is going on kind of along those same kinds of paradigms. But the key word, at least in the concept that I have been able to grasp so far without having read your book yet, is the concept of governance. And what do we exactly mean by governance? And our notions of governance so far that we have, at least for private sector, but it also applies to government and not-for-profits and social, and certainly the social sector, is one that is a template, the paradigm emerged from the middle of 20th century industrial capitalism model for governance. At least that's the way that we have. And it looks like our technological paradigm has moved way beyond that. And we are still trying to look for governance. And it seems like yours is a suggestion for how to govern some of those technological private sector entities, but could we extrapolate a more general notion of governance from what you are saying that could apply to other sectors as well?
Yes. That was easy. I mean, one of the points that I make early on in the book is that in a lot of ways, like the traditional sort of Westphalian notion of like a bunch of states like sailing along like islands, like isn't really the case anymore. And, you know, sociologists and political scientists of others like recognize that that's not really the case in a lot of respects. And I mean, I also think so I do think that sort of thinking about these companies, you know, one of the reasons that I suggest toward the end of the book that maybe we ought to make these companies subjects of human rights law in the same way as we make states subjects of human rights law is because like we can recognize that in a lot of ways they stand with respect to their users in ways similar to the sort of traditional conception of states. So yeah, I mean, I just want to say yes to that question.
Have any of the platforms in doing governance started to use AI?
Kind of. I mean, I say kind of because they've been flogging the AI thing since forever. There's this sort of joke that goes around, or at least was going around a few years back in Menlo Park, where like, the first time some new data scientist got hired onto like an integrity team, the first thing they'd do would be to try to create a misinformation classifier. And they'd do that and it would be a failure because it's inherently a failure. And then, that would kind of be their hazing ritual for like learning to be competent at their job. I mean, I do think that, and so like I would say, as far as I know, all the companies keep trying in the sense that, I mean, so like sort of basic like classifiers, like, hey, is this hate speech? Is this not? That's been going on for years and years and years and years and years and years and years. Like they keep trying to expand the domain, but they haven't yet been able to just get rid of armies of underpaid humans offshored in, developing countries.
Hi, thanks so much. Super interesting. Rachel Fleischman, I'm a Kellogg alum and sustainability professional. Two very different questions, one sort of broad and philosophical, the other is very pointed. The broad philosophical one is, could governance work, given that we don't actually have any democratic systems to model it after? We don't have democracies, we have representative democracies because people just don't have the time or the capability or the interest, or they're too busy, they're too lazy, whatever, to pay enough attention to actually be astute observers and regulators of a common discourse. And if someone does, then it's because they don't have another job. And then they're not participating in that part of our democracy. So would it actually work? Would you attract the right number of the right kind of people to make the right kind of decisions to serve the public good, I guess is the question in a practical sense. And then the narrow question is, I would really be interested in your thoughts on DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations from crypto, because they supposedly are self-governing, and from my very narrow view of them living with somebody who works for one, they don't seem to work at all.
Yeah. Okay. So the first of those, I mean, I think so. A few thoughts, right? One is that, like, this is necessarily going to have to be very experimentalist, right? So there are lots of different ways to, think about like group size for decision making, think about selection processes for groups, think about the ways that different groups interact with one another, think about who gets to be included, critically think about like how much we pay them on the assumption that we'll have to pay them at all for exactly those incentive-based reasons, right? Like I think that, we're going, if we ever implement anything, even sort of proximate, however distantly, to the kind of reform that I propose, it would have to be done in an experimentalist way because, yeah, I do think that we lack sort of recent, strong examples of how this kind of system works. And there's only so far that analogy can Athens go. Like, I love taking my analogies to Athens up to the actual limit of where they're possible, but, that limit can sometimes be a little bit lower than I'd like it to be. DAOs, there's this thing that like the cryptocurrency people love to do, which is that they like to like do some kind of thing with like cryptography and like attaching sort of weights and decisions to cryptography, and then they like to assimilate it to political and legal concepts that simply don't apply. Right? My other favorite example of that is smart contracts, which, as far as I can tell, bear like essentially no relationship to a contract. I have very little to say about that other than like I'd like to see someone involved in one of those experiments actually thoughtfully engage with like anybody who's ever talked about what the concepts that they're drawing on actually require.
Can I ask a follow-up question that's like maybe like bringing the spirit of the DAO in crypto without actually forcing you to talk about cryptocurrency, but still talking about technical decentralization because so in the time since you've written the book, we have seen a sort of skyrocketing popularity of things like Mastodon and Blue Sky, which are sort of decentralized social networking. And so you do mention them a few times, but you're kind of like, well, let's see how these play out. And so now I guess I'm asking you, like, now that we've seen how they've played out over the last couple of years, how do they fit into your scheme? What do they raise new challenges for you? Do they solve some problems?
Yeah, it's a really good, of course, that's a really good question. Like, it turns out when, the Buffett Center asks you who's the good interlocutor, and you name somebody who A, is like expert in the field, and also B, like really sympathetic to the project, that you get great questions. Who knew? But I think so it's really interesting, right? Because there's a sense in which like the sort of progress of all of these like post-Twitters should actually kind of depress us, right? Because, the actually decentralized one, namely Mastodon, appears to have like one user at any given time, or 100% of the users are programmers of various kinds. And that's kind of an issue. I haven't actually seen any decentralization yet from Blue Sky or Threads, like not in any serious sense. I think that what I'll say in terms of sort of salvation of my entire program is that like Twitter clone decentralization is very different from the kinds of decentralization that I think about. Partly just because, like, the incentives aren't right with this. Like, the reason there are no users on Mastodon is, it turns out if you take a version of Twitter where the only difference is that you have to do 10 times as much work to get it going, and, like, there's no compensation for that extra work, that, like, nobody does it. Duh. Right? Like, I think that, any kind of decentralization, whether that's decentralized governance or just decentralized participation, has to give like real attention to the incentives and the constraints that people are under, which is why, I hate to be a broken record, but like if we're going to create citizen juries, like, and this is again, like I am going to like go to my Athens analogy again, right? Like one of the big things in Athens, like the sort of great Periclean achievement, like, Pericles, right, like the Athens guy after Solon and Cleisthenes, was to take jury pay and expand it to like the assembly, right? So this idea that we recognize that people live in bodies and that asking them to participate in like shared decision making without regarding the fact that they are stuffed in meat sacks that have to be fed and housed and slept. And that like not choosing to feed and house and sleep the bodies means that you're going to introduce biases, most commonly class biases, but also lots of others, into your governance system, is something that dates back to Athens, and I think is something that, but all of the people creating these decentralized systems, whether they're Mastodon or like various cryptocurrency things, right? These all tend to be like socioeconomically advantaged nerds who don't understand that, like, because they're willing to spend 10,000 hours a day, like, arguing with people over Wikipedia fact-checking, that normal people aren't. And, like, we need to address that. That turned into a bit of a rant, sorry.
I am very confused about what you want to accomplish. In other words, governance, societies. This world is comprised of many governance or establishments and many societies. And I think about the web, and it's going back way to the opening days when it was first created. and they talked about who's going to look over this web and who's going to govern it. And there's not been any organization that came up that's doing it. And now we have AI and we have the same situation. How are we going to govern it under your thoughts?
I mean, we do have tons of governance. This is bad governance, right? I mean, you know, the early web people did create governance entities. Like, I mean, some of it actually kind of decent, right? So, you know, web like 1.0, the sort of big fight was over the domain name system. They came up with ICANN, which is the sort of like interesting multi-stakeholder kind of organization. Like it, you know, it has its problems, but all in all, it seems to have kept the lights on, more or less. I mean, you know, we do like you know, power actually does abhor a vacuum, right? So, you know, I think one of the premises of this project is that right now we have a lot of like not super well suited for the task private companies that are actually governing like most of the content on the internet. Like the huge, like when you and I these days go to the internet to do something, we're probably going through some service that has an army of lawyers that have actually like written rules and created enforcement procedures within the domain of that entity to determine what we can do. Like governance already exists. We just need to do it less incompetently.
Thanks. Doreen Weisenhouse. I teach media law and policy at Pritzker School of Law with, hey, you promised me a copy of that book and not an e-book. And also at the Medill School of Journalism. So, Paul, forgive me for not having read your book yet, but you know, so in the US and in so many other parts of the world, there isn't this regulation of the platforms. And so we talked a lot today about governance by platforms, but I want to go back to that first slide, and I think this gentleman right before me addressed it, you know, governance of platforms. The EU has been quite aggressive, and I don't know how much you address that. And it started out with the GDPR back in 2016, but in the last 2 years with the Digital Services Act, they've really gone into a lot of the issues that you talked about, which is first disinformation and make sure there isn't hate speech. But now they're really kind of looking at what impact on fundamental rights that citizens in the EU with the 24+ countries that govern that. What impact do you think that has, if anything, beyond those jurisdictions?
So thank you for that. So I think there are two different sort of sites where we might think of like the sort of task of platform governance in the abstract. There's the sort of sites where the company's interests are in conflict with the public interest and sites where they're aligned. So like a lot of the best EU work has been done in places where there's a conflict of interest. So the GDPR is the sort of plain example, right? Like in the case of privacy, like companies are our enemy, frankly, right? Like companies have a clear incentive to hoover up as much individual data as possible and monetize it. The public interest is to stop that. You know, that's a sort of quintessential case for like top-down direct regulation of the sort that the EU does. And I think that they've done generally a pretty good job at it. I mean, not perfect, like some of the stuff they do in intellectual property. But I mean, that's also because of another conflict of interest. It turns out that when you've got, you know, the entire media industry on the other side, you know, Larry Lessig was right. Like basically all of IP law is corruption. None of my IP colleagues are here, are they? No, good. Okay. Larry Lessig was right about that all along. There we go. But, you know, I think when we get into things like the Digital Services Act, things like efforts to control misinformation by telling companies to control misinformation. I think that these are aligned with the general project of the book right now, as these are like governments essentially intervening on governance by platforms, saying, here are the success criteria that you have to achieve in order to be doing a good job at your governance function. But I think I think that's great. But it doesn't necessarily address the sort of challenges of actually carrying that out. And so, the reforms that I propose are more directed at, like, okay, I'm glad the EU is, it addresses some of them, right? In a way, you can think of the EU as sort of intervening on companies to give them reason to prefer their long-term interests by providing the stick of EU law behind that. But, that sort of prompts the question, like, okay, how do we actually we the companies, successfully comply with these legal frameworks? How do we design the tools that allow us to do that? And I don't think you can avoid the idea that, like, some degree of participatory character is going to be necessary to make it work.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for these great questions. Thank you to Paul for writing a great book that created them all.
We have been instructed to tell you that we're going directly to the reception out there with wine, and we're not lingering here. We've been firmly instructed by the Buffett Center to take everybody to the reception out in the lobby.
I want to talk to Paul. He'll be out there.